Or if you have a nasty rash, keeping you up at night. Don't worry about a thing.
Don't worry.
'Cause Atticus Health will make you feel alright.
I'm Ilana Razbash, and this is Radio Architecture.
Good evening from beautiful Bunurong country. We are broadcasting to you live on Radio Karam from the unceded lands of the Eastern Kulin Nations. As always, if you'd like to join the conversation this evening, please text us on 0493 213 831. We'd love to have you with us. My guest and conversation partner this evening is Dr. Norman Day. He is a renowned Australian architect, educator and writer, celebrated for his innovative contributions to contemporary architecture. After early work with Romberg and Boyd, Day established his own practice in 1971, gaining prominence in the 1980s as a leader in postmodern architecture. His firm, Norman Day and Associates, has completed significant projects in Australia and Southeast Asia, including Mowbray College, the Australian New Zealand College of Anaesthetists headquarters, RMIT International University, Vietnam, and the Canto University Learning Resource Centre. Day has played a pivotal role in the reconstruction of East Timor, contributing to projects such as Zana Gusamo Reading Room and serving as a board member of Architects Without Frontiers. He is an adjunct professor of architecture at RMIT University, which also awarded him an honorary doctorate in architecture. He is also an accomplished critic and author with works published in leading architectural journals and books which have since influenced a generation of architects. Welcome to the program, Norman.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Such an honour to have you on. A legend of Australian architecture.
Oh, I don't think there are any things as legends. There are just people who keep the tale going.
Of Melbourne architecture and of architectural advocacy and discourse and media. You're still very actively engaged in architectural communication and discourse.
Yeah, well, I mean, once you're an architect, that's it.
It's for life, isn't it?
Yeah, life is gone. You're inoculated against anything else. That's the way it is.
There's a question I like to ask all my guests, and that's, what's your earliest memory of a building or place?
It's interesting you should ask me that, because I did think about that a number of times over my practicing life. And one of the reasons I say that is because when I was very, very young, my mother told me I was going to be an architect. She instructed me that, you will be given what I was doing with my toys and all that sort of.
How old were you at the time?
3.
Wow. And
I remember not being able to pronounce it, which was a big problem. Anyway, but that time, I do remember, I had my tonsils out. We were living in Perth, and I had my tonsils out. In those days, if you had your tonsils out, you went into hospital. No family came near you because you might, give them disease or something. And I went into this huge post-war, what had been used in the war, shed in a hospital in Perth. And I was the only child, but later on, about the same day I got there, another child turned up. And there were about 20 or 30 beds. And I remember the space, the quality of space, because I hadn't ever been in a space like that as a child, sleeping in this huge barn and watching the light come in through the windows, a whole lot of regular windows like an army shed. And they had a wispy sort of curtains that came in with the sun, the wind in the afternoon. The Fremantle doctor blew in. And eventually I discovered my friend right up the other end as a little face that came up to see me. And my first reaction was, what a wonderful friend. I've got someone to talk to finally. And he was a local Aboriginal child, and I'd been going to school in Perth with Aboriginal children, so I knew them well, and we had a lot of things to talk about. But my auntie, who came to see me one day, was devastated that we be mixed in with these, different coloured, different racial things. And I just could never understand that. I thought, well, this is... Because we were talking about the place, my friend and I.
Yes.
And the window and the things that you relate to is when you're a child, even though we're very young. And I do remember that as my first connection with space, place,
Yes.
light, those things.
At what year was this as well? Like the context of
that'd be early 50s.
So well and truly pre-referendum on Indigenous vote pre. That was
everything
became
me is
60.
pre-referendum.
That was still well and truly white Australia policy.
Absolutely.
A very, very different time.
And in Perth, it was very much that way. There were pearls and little cashmere jackets, and that was very conservative, very conservative.
How old were you when you came to Melbourne?
So we were born in Melbourne. We went to live in Perth because my dad got a transfer. And then we came back, as it turns out, for the Olympic Games in Melbourne, 1955. And the reason for that, of course, my dad was a mad sporty and he just had to be back in Melbourne for the Olympic Games, so we did. But the 5 years in Perth were fabulous.
Do you remember the swimming pool being built or any of the other architectural commissions for those Olympics?
Not so much the swimming pool. I was aware of it, but the one that got me, and it went back to my previous time in Perth, was the Stanhill building by Romberg in Queens Road, which is where we live, by the way. This great big white ship that had moored itself on Queens Road, between Queens Road and Sekulda Road, and I was so blessed, I suppose, to make those connections between that and when I was in Perth. I'd gone to see the big liners down at Fremantle delivering the migrants from Europe. And the two came together. It was just, I suddenly realised that, a great big ship and a great big building can be the same-ish. And so the romance of building in those sort of ideas to architecture.
And the possibility of design.
And absolutely.
All those feelings and memories that it can evoke in you. How old were you when you had that understanding?
Oh, well, pretty young. Although I still had my mum telling me, but one of her uncles was an architect in Melbourne in the 20s. He died very young, Ballantyne and Hare. His name was Harry Hare. And he was very, quite famous actually, engineer and an architect. He designed a lot of the theatres, the Reveley Theatre and the Regent Theatre in the city and those sort of things. But she knew of him because she was taken in under his arm and celebrated as, I think, the oldest sibling of her generation. And she adored him, but he died quite young, 38, with about 7 children under his belt. But she used to tell me that he, as an architect, built bridges. And I said, oh, I don't think so. That wasn't my reading of it. I'd started reading about architecture and reading history. And I, even though I was very young, it was almost from then on that I knew what I was going to do. It was just a matter then, how am I going to do it? So it was the introduction through those connections, I suppose.
And who were your greatest teachers during your studies?
I was lucky that I had really good teachers. I was at Melbourne University, and we had Hugh O'Neill, who was a terrific teacher, just so theatrical and blessed, and it was otherworldly. And he only died quite recently, but he never changed. He was always otherworldly, almost spiritual, just looking for the wings on his back, to see how that angel worked. Wonderful man, extremely generous in his character and his support for ideas, even if the ideas were often not very good. And so that was one, but I also had people involved in the structural component of the course, because all of my education had been in literature, art, history. I had not done maths, I had not done physics. In fact, I'd failed them dismally in year 10. I got 3 out of 100, one for each one for turning up. And so I had to repeat through the course a lot of the hard mathematical subjects, which were part of the course then, quite a big part of the course. And I got to know those teachers more than anyone else, because I had to see them every summer and every winter and every autumn. So Beth and Al Caldecott, who taught structures, and did it with such an inventiveness and a strong political leaning to the left. And Blanche Mertz, who was their colleague. Blanche was as wild as a cookie. She was the most gorgeous thing I've ever seen in terms of you got a box of makeup, put it all on every morning. She was fabulous, so exotic and theatrical, and extremely intelligent. And we got on so well. I was so lucky to have her in a part of the course that I was really, really struggling with. So I was blessed to have people teach me the part that I had a lot of trouble with in such a romantic and exciting way.
That support, those mentors that actually go in hard to help and to help you succeed are huge. They're everything.
Usually. But then in the design side of it, I ended up dealing with people I didn't much admire. So I just thought they were stuck. But I was very lucky. I failed year 3. Of course I did, because I couldn't do those structures. And I had half a week off, or nearly a whole week off, to repeat the next year. And I thought, well, I better get a job working in architecture while I've got all that time. And I made a list, where would I want to work? So I made the list. On top of the list was Robin Boyd, because I'd been writing essays about Robin Boyd since I was in primary school. And one day I knocked on the door, Sunday morning. I'd just been to the beach. I had sand all over me and up every orifice. I didn't expect him to be there. I was just going to leave a little note. But he answered the door, because he always spent his Sundays writing in the office. And he said, come on in. I told him what my story was. And he said, no, well, we're not employing anyone at this stage. There are only 5 people in the office. And he said, but what have you been doing anyway recently? And I said, oh, well, I've just come back from Japan, did a tour there, a student tour. Oh, well, that's entirely different. We've just picked up Expo 70 in Osaka, started Monday.
Oh.
So there you go, from there on. And that, of course, once you get that experience, working in an office of 5 with Robin Boyd, that's it. You're gone. You know, nothing can fail from there.
And what was he like personally to work with? How do you remember him?
Well, I was lucky because I had the conversation with him, but Frederick Romberg, his partner, was professor at Newcastle. But the professor used to come down every month and talk to us. And he would talk to us. Boyd never did that. He talked with us. But I loved both of them. They were both contrasting. Boyd was as gentle and kind and understanding as you could possibly imagine a person to be. But he had a very sharp wit and a very sharp intelligence. And so you had to be careful where you trod, because if it looked like you were being a fool, he wouldn't tell you, but he'd give a look and you'd know that it just really... I remember one stage I'd been drawing a landscape drawing, and I said to him, I've got all things right, and I tried to make these plants look like cotoneasters. And he just looked at me slowly and he said, you mean cotoneasters, Norman?
Huh?
That was the way Boyd worked. Romberg, quite different, quite different. I worked with Romberg when Boyd was ill at the end of his life. I went up to Newcastle and worked with Romberg for a while. And he had me doing a project, and he was very fussy about the documentation and the quality of workmanship, very Germanic, because he was German. And he had me drawing gutter on the side of a building, and I was pretty proud of my drawing. I'd learned how to draw properly by then. And I thought it was wonderful. I took it to him to show him where the drawing was at one stage, and he looked at it and he said, no, that's just no good. The gutter is... I said, but it's perfect. It's perfect. Really, it's perfect. He said, no. Gutters have slopes on them. You've got to draw them with a slope. And I said, oh, my God. So another lesson, you know.
It was an elevation.
The slope was half a degree. At 1 to 100, that's nothing, but I had to draw it. So wonderful contrasts in learning.
Wow. What lessons from them are still with you to this day? That you can hear their voices?
Yeah, respect for the art, respect for the detail, overwhelming respect for the human part about what we do, of dealing with people and dealing with spaces for people. The respect for the humanity that let us invent architecture. That was the underlying strength. That was
Do you think that's being forgotten at times?
No. I think architects have got greedy for money. If you do architecture for money, then you've got a very different approach to what you do and how you do it. We didn't do it for money. I can promise you, Robin Boyd didn't do it for money because he ended up with none. So it wasn't done for that reason. It was done because there was respect for the career, if you like. It wasn't considered to be puncy or arty or anything. It was just doing it really, really well, as good as it could be done.
Fact check something for me. There's, of course, an urban legend that Robin Boyd used to draw a document on 6 sheets of paper for a whole project.
Oh, no. Robin Boyd never documented anything apart from his own house. In the early days, he did. His own house, for example, he drew that entirely on one sheet, A3, the whole drawing. And there are mistakes in it, but I won't go into that.
Wall Street house. With
Wall Street, yeah. It's a beautiful set of drawings, but it's one drawing. And he built the whole building from that. Very, very talented, yeah. But the majority of the way Boyd worked was he would design a building on a little, he was left-handed, and he'd draw everything with a funny, holding the pencil the wrong way, on a little quattro piece of drawing, freehand. Beautiful drawings, of course, because his dad was an artist and he was essentially too. But he'd then put notes on it and he'd give it to whoever it was in the office who would take that project and say, go on, off you go, you do the rest. So we managed a project from go to woe right through in each of the projects we did. But Boyd designed it.
Still classically what happens in practices today, nonetheless. There may be a design lead and a team that helps deliver it and document it and bring it through. What was that moment for yourself when you realised it was time to start your own practice?
Oh, that was pretty easy. Boyd died. And I was young. I just graduated. I had done the year before he died. I worked on the project, the Neptune's Fishbowl project. That was one of those that he gave me, and that was my first freestanding building ever. And it just gave me enormous confidence to think, well, if I can, manage that at my age, still undergraduate, I was just graduating that year, then I reckon I can pretty well get on with anything. But I worked through with Romberg for another 18 months after Boyd died because we had projects there to complete. The rest of the office had to leave because we had absolutely no money at all. And so I stayed there for free, as I found out, for about 18 months. And then I started to get some people phoning and saying, would you be interested in doing this work, my sort of clients? And then I said to Romberg, well, I think I'll just give it a go, yeah.
How did you, when you're conceptualising your practice and what you believed architecture to be, particularly as Romberg and Boyd were your biggest teachers and the design school didn't quite give you what you were looking for, how did you conceptualise your point of difference?
I always took the view that an architect has a creative role. But I've also taken the view right from the start that architecture is constructed morality. I can look at a piece of architecture anytime, and I used to when I was quite young, and look at a detail, look at bits of the way it's put together, and I can make an assessment about whether that architect's dinky-die or not. If you don't put the building together properly, that means probably nothing about it's been done properly. So I'm a very careful judge of how things are done. The art of the minimum combines to make the art of the lot. That to me is very important. So I committed to doing things well, which means you have to understand how things are built. You have to understand materials, and you have to understand what the wind will do in the morning when the Fremantle doctor comes through. So all the messages from life.
And that's connecting to place.
Absolutely.
That's being connected to place.
And people. If you don't get the understanding with the people right, then you're just really wasting your time.
Absolutely. I love that phrase, constructed morality.
Yeah, it's important.
It's like Churchill used to say, we build our cities and our cities shape us.
Yeah, it's critical to me. That's if you can't do that, then why bother?
It has to be for people at the end of the day.
It does, and it will last if it is. But if it isn't, and it's just built for money, which a lot of architecture is, then you may as well just pull it down in 20 years because it's not worth anything. And much of our economy that's the way it is, which I think is awful. Waste of money.
Something that's built with love, with intention, with care, then people want to preserve it and protect it, right?
Yeah.
That's true sustainability.
Yeah. Real things should last, but they've got to be real to begin with.
What was your first breakthrough project?
Well, to be quite fair about it, the fishbowl was, because it was a little bit outlandish. My view, some people have said it's the first postmodern building that was built in Australia. That's totally untrue. It's the last modern building that was built in Australia. It's not a postmodern building at all. It's not a decorated shed. It's a realistic interpretation of a building that looks like what it's meant to be. A fishbowl, literally, that has fish in it. So that to me gave me the confidence. And one of the reasons I say that is when Boyd designed it and had this great big 10-metre dome on ball on top of it, he said to me, do you think we can do this? We had this quiet discussion. And I said, I wouldn't have a clue. And of course, Mr. Structural, me, I had absolutely no idea, but I wasn't going to give up. If Boyd said that's what it will be, then that's what it will be. So that's when I started to learn the strength of connections, the inventiveness that you can have as an architect, and how you can find creative ways to do things. And I went back to those three people at university, the Caldercutts and Blanche Mertz, and said, I've got a problem. I've got to design this ball, and I have no idea how to do it structurally or how it will hold up. If we build it, will it burn down? All those basic questions. Can it be done? And they said, well, there's always a way, but it does look a bit odd. And they introduced me to an engineer at Melbourne University, Francis, his name was, and he said, yeah, we can do that. We'll break it into segments, and it became a thing made of triangles that were shaped, called a dodecahedron. And we'll see how it goes, but it was still very risky. And at one stage, Boyd said to me, how are you going to detail it? How are you going to get those sections of the ball to lock in together and not leak and not fall over? And I said, well, what I've done is I've mapped it out full scale on a car park in chalk, and I've measured up the chalk drawing, and I'm going to draw that up. And I remember him looking at me thinking, I think he must have been thinking, should I check my PI insurance? Because that was extremely risky. I mean, no one these days would ever do that to a young staff member who was still not a graduate. Extreme faith he put in to us to let that happen. And we got somewhere. We found a group of guys up in the Dandenongs, a couple of German guys with big dogs and lots of beer, who said they could build it. And they came down to Melbourne. They built it all in components, and it arrived. And they were going to build the bottom third of the ball on the building, and then build the other one at the car park, and then lift it in a crane. And at that stage, I was down on the Sunday morning to see it all happen. And it was starting to be craned up, and I thought, I better get Mr. Boyd out, because he lived just around the corner. And I phoned him and I said, you better come down. They're putting the ball together on site. And he was pretty excited, so he drove down there and we had a look. And when they lifted it up, the ball shrunk a bit because it wasn't a complete ball. So when they went to put it on top of the base of the thing, it didn't fit. And all I can remember is this very pale-looking face standing next to me saying, Norman, let me know when it's right. And he drove home. That was a bit embarrassment.
That's haunting.
Yeah, it does haunt you, but the courage that he had to let me do that is incredible. So from then on, I thought, well, really, if I can do that, I'm pretty sure I can do anything. I mean, that was a huge challenge.
Huge. And then was the registration process not too hard back then, or it was?
Registration was pretty easy. I'd filled out my logbook because I'd been working with Boyd since third year, so I had all my things ready. But also, it was all done very casually. Then you went to a little place in the city, and the registrar was only one guy, and he was also at the Institute of Architects, I think, would come out, Richard, someone, and he said, what are you doing? And I explained, and he said, oh, and you work with Robin Boyd? And I said, yes. And he said, well, you're registered then. Pay me $60 and that's it, thank you. No exams, no nothing. He just trusted the system was different.
And you were off. I want to circle back to that idea of constructed morality, because the Ministry of Housing infill projects that are super famous is still such precedents for students, for anyone who's studying architectural history to this day, that your colleagues and contemporaries at the time too, also Edmund and Corrigan with K Street, did that was super famous, and your project Fitzroy House. And beautifully photographed too by John Gollins.
Yeah.
The famous kind of sunset skies, almost this surrealist, almost images. How important was that program?
Well, we thought it was very important because not all of us, but many of us who were involved at that stage, there were about 7 or 8 practices, I think. Crone, Burgess, me, Corrigan, a couple of others.
And they were all younger as well, weren't they? They were fairly emerging at this time.
Most of us were, not Corrigan, of course, but no, I'm joking. Yeah, we were young. The Ministry of Housing at the time had a policy of not demolishing suburbs, the Carlton and Fitzroy and so on, and putting up high-rise. So this was the way to do it with infill housing. So in principle, it had all the things that, you know, attract an architect's attention. The capacity to not have to destroy inner suburbs, the capacity to do things inventively for the public good that were not for the wealthy people of the world, and to contribute something, you know, social.
And the clients were known to you at the time as well.
No,
when you no,
not at all. Didn't meet them at all. No,
okay.
Because they were all tenants. They were public
Yes.
housing tenants. They were selected, I think, based on what was built. And
so that's a little urban legend I've heard. Then you're doing a lot of myth busting for me tonight.
I don't think anyone was pre-selected as a client. We certainly never dealt with them in one-on-ones. We dealt with them in groups where we sat down and had chats. But who would be living in them? No, we had no idea.
Who would end up in your exact one?
Yeah, and that may well be too, because there'd be quite a mobile generation. I mean, we ended up doing, I think I ended up doing about 30 or 36 public of that order, some in Ballarat, some in Northcote and some in Fitzroy, so quite a number. And there are all different sorts of people, all different. So
these programs also gave emerging firms, I really hate that word, but they gave younger practices that were starting out the opportunity to do some really meaningful and important work that became really famous projects.
Yeah.
And I wonder, can we return back to that vision of giving those innovative architects opportunities?
Well, I think that was to do with the Ministry of Housing guiding it. It's I can't exactly remember. In the back of my mind, I have in memory that at that time, our Minister for Housing was Jeff Kennett, Liberal Party. Could be wrong. But it was, so it wasn't politically driven in that sense. It was architecturally driven. And they employed some people from the best people who'd been working in Woolloomooloo in Sydney, who'd been doing infill housing, brought them down to Melbourne to get the program up. And it was an important program. It had lots of promise for retaining the character, but the main thing was it would retain the character with a Melbourne character. So we all were doing in our versions of Melbourne in a contemporary sense.
That was such a big question, really, in the 80s and the 90s and postmodernist era of discovering Melbourne architecture and Australian architecture. How do you define Australian architecture?
It's done by an Australian. I think it's really quite simple. If you think you're not an Australian, then you shouldn't be doing an Australian architecture. There are a lot of architects who don't really have the faith in the architecture, in the Australian culture. You have to have faith in the Australian culture to be able to be an Australian architect.
Say more. What do you mean by that?
Oh, I've got colleagues I went through with, and young and old, who were quite convinced that the solution to architecture came from Europe or America, and we simply had to import it at the best possible way we could. but it didn't necessarily relate to an Australian culture or a sense of an Australian identity. So some people didn't like that idea at all. It was not part of their game plan. But it's a funny thing, when they build things, it sort of ends up being a bit Australian. So, you know, a classic case of that would be Alan Powell, for example. And Alan's work, the late Alan Powell. Alan and I went to school together. We went through university together. We knew each other very, very well. Alan's idea was that architecture was more international, more global, more far-reaching, outside of a local context. And he got that idea from working with Guildford Bell, so there was a continuity. But it still couldn't end up being anything but Australian. So, you know, Tarrawarra Museum, for example, that Alan did is still Australian.
It's amazing how you actually can't run from your own truth in that way.
Yeah.
You can't run from that knowing, the design sensibility, that connection to place, that truth in your own context, your own identity.
But some people aren't that interested in the Australian culture. I mean, there's a truth about that in a way with Boyd, for example. Boyd was not interested in Australian football or cricket or sports.
He founded the Anti-Football League.
No, that was a colleague of his, a journalist. But no, Boyd wasn't anti anything really, but he wasn't pro ochreism. Of all the things that he disliked most was flies. He hated flies. And he made a big thing of it in his last book. He wrote about that quite a bit. But it was just not his character. He was different. He was almost universally different. But by being what he was very Australian. And one of the clues about that is whenever you see a Boyd drawing of a building, it's complete with leaves and trees, and there are always gum trees. And he never left Australia to go work overseas, which he should have done in his 50s and 60s. He could have gone permanently to the States and, in my view, been really successful. But he liked Australia, and Australia's bush too much.
Mm.
Romberg had the same compassion for Australia. Romberg was a German, obviously, and he was interred during the war, because all Germans were, which basically means put in prison-ish. But the prison was located in the middle of Australia, and they would be building roads or whatever. Soon he got to be in charge of road gangs and things. He was never going to be behind a shovel. But he gained this enormous passion for Middle Australia, for the outback, the red heart. And so pretty well every year since that time, which is the war period, every year or every second year, he would drive with a volley of people from the office. They'd go out into Central Australia and just camp and engage.
Wow. Did you join him in?
No,
in
I
his
was way too young for that. There was a generation before me, but wonderful stories. Yeah.
It's like Snohetta apparently climbed the mountain Snohetta together every year.
Yeah, had to do it, and the connection was very strong. And here's this strangely sophisticated German architect. He spent a lot of time in Switzerland, a legal family, born in China, loved the Australian outback. It just gets to you. Mm. Other people find it the complete opposite. We had Rem Koolhaas out here for a lecture series at one stage, and Rem wanted to go and see the middle of Australia, the big rock, he said. And so we went to some trouble to get him a flight and got him there. He got out of the plane, was halfway down the stairs, had a look around, and got straight back in. He almost had a nervous breakdown. The space nearly killed him. He just couldn't handle that spaciousness. So
and
everyone's a bit different.
The vastness of Australia.
Too much for him.
You can put all of Europe as a continent into Australia and it would still have space left over.
Yeah, so interesting.
You've also been involved with architectural criticism and journalism. You still write for The Age. You have basically been writing for The Age since 1976.
It's a long time, isn't it?
Why is it important to speak about the profession?
Oh, I don't speak about the profession so much. I speak about architecture. I'm much less interested in the profession than a lot of people are. I don't believe we should have a profession of architecture. I think architects, I don't think we should be the Institute of Architects. I think we should be the Institute of Architecture. There's a very big difference. We shouldn't be about just promoting architects. It should be about promoting architecture. There's a big difference between the two. And so I have a very strong view that it needs to be discussed at all levels with anyone who'll have an ear to listen and a contribution to make. No one's right or wrong about an opinion on architecture. Everyone should, put their bib in. So it was, to me, to try and explain what to a lot of people was a mystery. And I don't believe architecture is a mystery. I think architecture can be explained using common English language. I don't think it has to be complicated with buzzwords. But the majority of language that architects use is buzzwords. It's like, when you go to your heart surgeon, they come up with so many words you can't even understand what they're going to do to you. But it doesn't have to be like that. Architecture is so much more humane, so much more human, so much more enjoyable if you can discuss it at a proper level.
If you could give one message to the public about architecture, or the profession, is there one core idea you want them to hold on to?
Yeah, believe in what's possible, but don't trust manipulative words. I think there are a lot of what architects spin, or not even architects, but spinners of architecture, is basically garbage. It's there to sort of... If it was not, then you'd look at Melbourne and you'd say Melbourne could be a fine city, but Melbourne isn't a fine city. It's been destroyed by the commodification of architecture and the monetarisation of architecture.
By development.
By development and by people who just don't care. My advice to everyone is to do care about architecture. Good architecture can be so uplifting. And we've got plenty of examples around the world. There's nothing to be afraid of. We're a very young country still, so we've got a long way to go and a lot to be replaced.
And so much possibility, so much opportunity. Yeah. And architecture is about that hope. It is about that ambition. That's what it's all for.
So we can do it. And I have absolute confidence in the new and up-and-coming professionals being able to do that. But they'll need space. They'll need opportunity. And once they lock themselves into large companies and organisations, architectural organisations, they lose that capacity to be inventive because you've got to toe the party line.
And to hold responsibility too. What's your advice for young graduates and students at the moment and emerging architects?
Breathe in quite deeply, hold your nose and then jump. See what happens. You've got to trust yourself. But it does come down to honesty. You've just got to be honest with yourself and the people you're working with. And that will be... People might not like it. They might react to it. I've had lots of people react to my architecture saying, "God, that's garbage." But after a while, it rubs off on them and they get used to it and they think, "Oh, not too bad."
It takes time.
After 30 years.
For Federation Square, right? It took so long for the public to fall in love and become part of the identity.
Well, it needed a bit of convincing.
And heritage listing. And
a lot of that was to do with public discussion, like Barry Humphries saying it's just garbage, it's like a toilet. If that sort of thing happens in the public realm, architects should embrace it and have the discussion. There's no point in hiding. So, because architects can't hide architecture. It's right out there.
It's right there.
And it's functional. It's not only about the look and everything, but it's the function and the contribution to society. So we have a big responsibility.
I want to pick up on that contribution to society a little bit as well, about architects without borders, architects without frontiers, and particularly your work in East Timor. How important is it to be involved in these sort of projects, or projects that give you opportunity to give back?
Yeah, sort of. I know it sounds glamorous, but to be honest with you, about 15, 20 years ago, I was sat down with my accountant. I was quite busy and I had a lot of projects on. And I sat down, he put a bit of paper in front of me and he said, "There's your tax bill for the year." And I got the fright of my life. It had lots of noughts on it. I said, "What are you talking about? I'm not a wealthy person. What's this all about? And he said, you've been earning a lot of money and you're going to have to pay a lot of tax. I said, oh, that's fair enough. I understand that, but I don't feel like I have. I don't feel satisfied with that. Because if that money all goes, that tax money all goes to Canberra, they're going to buy jets and bullets with it. I'm not very pleased with that. I don't like the way they spend my money. Sounds a bit Frank Packer, doesn't it? But he said, I said, so what do I do? And he said, well, don't earn as much. Why don't you do what a lot of other people do? Spend an amount of your time pro bono, doing work for people without charging fees. And I thought, well, that's a damn good idea. So I started to do that, and I got involved with Esther Charlesworth at Architects Without Frontiers. That's pretty easy. There's no money there. And then eventually through friends, we got involved in East Timor. We got a telephone call from a friend who said, would you be interested or do you know people who could assist in settling down East Timor? They voted for their freedom. This is in 1999, 2000, they got their freedom, independence, I mean, and they need some help because the place has been destroyed and they want to know how they can go proceed, to build more. So we put a team together and went up there, and we've been going ever since to... the deal initially was we thought we'd create things and help them out as architects, but we soon learned in the first trip that our job was to listen, not do stuff.
Yes.
So almost committed right from the start to not building anything. We've done a couple of smaller projects there. We did their embassy in Canberra, but the idea really was more to empower them to rebuild them themselves. So teaching them to be architects, helping them to be architects, helping them to think. And we've been advising the two leaders who have been on and off, Prime Minister and President, Xanana Gusmao and Jose Ramos-Horta, ever since. So we've been well connected in that sense, but it's slow and steady. The main thing is that there's some sort of a judgment about quality and not a rush. So that's what our job's been there. Architects Without Frontiers is all over the place. It's just a whole lot of people who have probably never met an architect. I mean, we've got people in Fiji who certainly haven't met an architect. People in Asia and in Northern Australia, of course. People who just need help. And it seems to me, well, that's one thing we can do. We can help them. So it's been good.
Such a huge part of that, right, is, as you said, listening is the core work of the architect, and empowering people and giving them that confidence to proceed with their own work, to bring their own realities into existence.
In a way, but it's also educational. Part of the initial work we did in Dili, in East Timor, was we had some people who'd been studying architecture, but there was no studies of architecture in East Timor. So they'd gone to Indonesia, to Kapong, but they had to come back when the election was on, otherwise they would have been gone missing. So they came back, but they had not much to do, and but they were an ambitious young group who needed just to finish graduation, and then they could get on with their architecture. So we helped them do that to an extent, but we used to have lots of meetings, and we formed an architectural association with them, anyone we could garner who was interested in ABLE, and they eventually became the sort of basis of the public architect for East Timor, and that's where they are now. But when we first discussed it with them, they were really anxious to build buildings that were quite large, not skyscrapers, but tall, glass, steel, aluminium.
Because that's what they thought they had to have.
That was modernity.
Yeah.
That's how you would make East Timor look modern, contemporary.
That new nation, newly independent.
And I said, no, let's start again. We have some superb materials available to us in East Timor. The bamboo is just to die for. It's fabulous stuff, structural. And everything grows so quickly in East Timor. So you've got all this vegetation, you've got this bamboo, you've got a tradition, and it's right on the equator, so you have a big sun problem to deal with. And Dili's quite a low-lying place, so it gets very stuffy. I said, we need to deal with these issues. And so you've got to rethink back. And they also grow a lot of cork in East Timor. So there's lots of opportunities, but they have to just rethink how they do that. And that's still in process, work in progress.
Do they have a local cork industry now? Has it set up into some
slow
material?
and steady. It's everything in East Timor. When we first got there, Janana said, "You think you're going to solve things in 10 years, don't you?" And we said, well, "Might do it quicker." And he said, no, it'll be 2 to 3 generations. Things here take time because we've got a whole 400 and 500 years of colonial stuff to turn over and lots of pain. They've been through lots of pain. So there's lots of things. And, it's still a very poor nation. Sorry, they don't have much, really. They're relying on a future that's based on oil and gas reserves, which is a bit of kilter with what the rest of us are thinking at this stage in our lives, but they'll have to trade that somehow.
Have you been able to see some results already from those projects? Is there perhaps something that surprised you?
No, not great surprises, except that it's in places like this, you often get what we call the cowboy nations. So people come into these places that are damaged with good intentions, perhaps. But
Paves the road to hell, right? Every time.
There's a lot of military and there's a lot of maddies, strange eyes, who just want to do good, but they're also a bit woppy. They're a bit off the twig, and so some odd things happen that shouldn't happen. So, for example, there's been a lot of concrete buildings built in Dili. Well, the frame has been built because there was a woman there who's got a concrete company and got very ambitious and built all these things, but they're not buildings, they're just concrete because that's as far as she could go. They now have to be completed somehow, but they're not conceived to be completed. So those sort of things can happen oddly, and then, something's going to have to be done about them. There was a huge amount of good faith that came about initially, and I remember one example was the Chinese built a great big prefabricated hotel on the beach of Dili to cater for all the people who are coming to help the people of Dili. And our job, part of the job we had to do was not look at the architecture so much, but how that would fit in for Dili and the people of Dili. That's what Rameswater asked to do. And so I went there and had a look at this place, and it seemed efficient enough. But there were a lot of rooms there, about 180 rooms. And I couldn't work out where the sewer was. And there was no sewage treatment plant. So I said to the guys, "Well, what are you doing with the sewer?" And they said, "Oh, the pipe, it just goes out into the bay." Well, the bay is where they catch the fish for the people of Dili. So I got in contact with Rameswater and I said, "I think we do have a minor problem here, some issue." And Rameswater gets quite excited, got in his car and came down with a group of people and slammed an order on them and said, "Well, just fix it up." So part of our job was sort of semi-architectural, but not really.
Putting sewers in.
Just
it's the bulk
getting
of it, isn't
some
it?
advice out there to help them because no one knew. No one knew where to look. So those things are good. There's a sense of, well, at least it's improved the fish life there.
The support that an architect offers, right? That hand holding, that knowledge. That's also the core of the work. That's the core of no matter what project it is, big or small. That's really what an architect does.
But you can also get a lot of disappointments. There are lots of things that don't go the way you want them to. So you do need to be very stubborn. I think one of my closest friends is Greg Burgess, for example, and Greg is renowned for being extremely gentle, very chilled, one with the country and one with the original inhabitants of Australia, and a great spiritual nature to him. That's true, but there's another part of Greg which I've known Greg right from when we studied together, because he and I had to repeat those structure things with the Culticuts. And Greg is actually stainless steel inside. He has a clipped machine that will not give in. He's very stubborn about getting things done right. So it looks soft and gentle and cuddly on the outside, but it's not. I had a journalist in the States, in New York once, who said, "Oh, you've got a friend, Greg Burgess, and what a cuddly koala sort of person that is." And I said, "No, he's not.
You don't know.
He's a dingo." And Greg doesn't like that story, but my view is he's much tougher than a cuddly koala. And I think you've got to be. Architects have to be very, very tough to hang on to their dreams. When you think of it, we start a project, it's probably going to be 2 years for small projects before they realise.
At least, yeah.
You've got to be pretty patient, but you've got to be very stern about retaining the ideas through that period because they will be pushed around a lot. So we have to be pretty stubborn.
What for you has been the biggest highlight of your career so far?
Survival's been good. Because when I started off, I really thought I was absolutely stupid. I had no idea how to set up a business or anything. I didn't ask anyone. I was too young. I was only 23, So I set up a thing. I bought a little building in Collingwood because I thought I'd better have an office. I had no money, but I bought a building in Collingwood. I went to the bank on the Monday after I'd bought it at auction and said, oh, by the way, I need some money to pay for it. The bank manager looked at me strangely. Then I put a sign up on it saying Norman Architects, and I thought, well, okay, I'm off. Here I go. But I must admit, after a year or two, I thought, is this going to last? I mean, I didn't have much work coming in, but it did. So you need to be able to last. You need to be able to survive to do the thing you want to do. And you can also, I mean, there are other parts of it which sometimes I rue, because one of the things about talking publicly about architecture especially, and architects, is that you can make enemies. You get a lot of people, you put on lots of noses off. It's joint. If you say someone is not a very good architect or their architecture isn't very good architecture, very often they're going to be a little annoyed.
How do you deal with criticism? What's your best methods?
Look, I just try and tell it the way I believe, but it does get some trouble sometimes. So, for example, for many years I was a member of the Institute of Architects, and I was on lots of boards and committees and won lots of awards and all that stuff, did the right thing. But after a while, when I was writing, the Institute of Architects is a club. It's a private club. It's not you don't have to be a member of the Institute of Architects. You do have to be a registered architect, but you don't have to be a member of the Institute of Architects. And so in the registration, in the Institute of Architects, there are certain conditions and rules and conduct that you're meant to obey. And one of them is you can't denigrate the profession in the eyes of the public. So if someone in the Institute of Architects says, I read that article that Dave wrote about my building, he is denigrating me in the eyes of the public, I can hardly say I'm not, because I was. I mean, there are some times, I remember one I wrote about a building in Prahran Police Station, where I said, it's quite a small article, but I said it basically looks like a cow's just sat there and plopped. And in language which wasn't dissimilar to that architect took offence. And so usually what they did, they'd phone the Institute of Architects, they'd say, have a hearing. And whenever they had a hearing, I had to go there, but I had to have a representative, or they could have got me into other trouble. And so in the end, the money I was getting paid to write for The Age, I was spending on legal fees every month. So it sort of became a bit ridiculous. So I retired from the Institute of Architects and haven't been a member since. And I understand the rules. The rules are fair. If that's what a member says and they're the conditions, well, then I shouldn't be a member because I wanted to tell some other truths.
Yeah. You take your job of communicating that incredibly seriously.
Yes, but you can do it in a way that doesn't insult other people. And I haven't done that necessarily. I don't write about architects in that sense. I write about architecture. And if architecture to me insults me, then I'm going to have to say it.
It's coming back to that point how you can't hide it.
Well, it's that thing about built morality. If I see a building that's immoral, in my view, then I've got to say it. I think the public should be aware.
We should also be able to hold those disagreements in the public discourse respectfully.
Oh, you can.
And when it's talking about built work, right?
Yeah.
And then something that is ultimately in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
Design, beauty, that's all is influenced by personal opinion. We should be able to talk about that and write about that and challenge it.
I don't think it's always about personal opinion. I think there are levels of architectural understanding. If you've got them, not everyone does, then I think you should speak about it to help people understand. Not everyone has that. It's not about taste.
Yeah.
It's got nothing to do with taste or you know, someone said to me, do you like that building? I couldn't give a damn whether I like the building or not. That's not the point. Is it a good building? That's the point.
Yes.
There's a difference. And
taste is sometimes even the problem.
yeah, and
Taste is a fad.
I don't like the idea anyway. It's, who cares? That's just subjective, you know, selfish. Not interested.
What's your criteria for good design?
Everything, right from the detail up. Has it been resolved right through? Is it, Boyd used to say, one idea totally carried through. And I think that is the essence of good architecture. So it's got a conceptual idea that's strong, that's worth fighting for and building. And then you take it through every element of the architect takes through the project. And that'll represent all sorts of things, like the human activity that's going into the building, the people themselves, if it's a house for a family, or a school for certain people. So it reacts to the issue of why we're building this thing and how consistently the architects applied that measure. If it's just, I got a page out of the book and, you know, it's quite often your clients will come along and they say, I've got 20 pages from Bell magazine or something. Why don't we just put them all together and smudge it into a building design? Well, that doesn't cut it. But that's a lot of buildings are built like that.
Because architecture is about ideas.
It's got to be a strong idea, not just an idea. It's got to be something worth fighting for. And then it'll be worth, then we'll hang on to it. It'll become worthy for heritage reasons, you know. It'll be worth holding.
It'll be worth building, worth all that sweat and all that labour and all that suffering and all that money.
And then when you think about it, that means it's a consistency towards the better environment. We don't have to pull stuff down and rebuild them with wasted materials and energy. It's got lots of good reasons.
Absolutely. I'm mindful of the time, so I want to ask my last question.
Yeah.
And that's, what gives you hope?
Oh, I'm really hopeful about the world improving. It's a funny period in history right now because we've got lots of good reasons to not feel like that, in my view. The leadership of the Western world anyway is abysmal. And that's a shame. But I think that can be turned around. There are going to be better people available to the world. The younger generation, in my view, are where it will be held. And the young generation that I see have inherited a crappy world from my generation. It hasn't been handled well. The post, the baby boomers and their post generation did not do nice things by the new generation. So the new generation takes on a lot of responsibility to fix the world up. But I have great optimism in them doing that.
Thank you so much for joining me on the program, Norman.
Pleasure.
Thanks for joining me for another evening of radio architecture with Ilana Razbash. This live show was broadcast and recorded in the Radio Karim studio on Bunurong country. You can replay the show wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in and supporting community radio. Take care.
Hi, I'm Angus Montaigne, all the way from Scotland.